Happy Sunday, everybody. Today's question is, what percentage of self-identifying Latter-day Saints are actually attending weekly? We've done some musings in the past, digging into some data. There's an interesting source, though, for this question that we're going to dig into. Before we get there, typically what happens is in polls and surveys, people are asked, what's your religion? Do you consider yourself active, practicing? How often do you attend? And so consistently across a lot of these polls, as it pertains to Latter-day Saints, there's been around 2/3 who say that they're attending weekly. For example, here's a recent Pew study looking at the percent of Mormons who attend religious services, and 77% of them said that they attend at least once a week. 13% said a few times a year. So 77% activity rate of at least once a week. Of course, in our faith, we have, youth activities and adult activities and other things throughout the week. But 77%, according to Pew, of people who are identifying themselves as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then who say, I attend at least weekly. Recently, also, the B.H. Roberts Foundation, they sent out postcards to about 80,000 people across the country, Latter-day Saints, trying to figure out the activity rate among other questions that they had for these individuals. Here's what they said. We decided to focus our research on what has been historically known as the Mormon Corridor, the areas of Western North America that were settled between 1850 and 1890 by members of the Church of Jesus Christ. Despite encompassing just 37% of America's Latter-day Saints, according to the 2020 census, this area represents a major cultural hub of the faith. So, in 2023, we sent out nearly 80,000 postcards to a random distribution of households within counties that had populations that were at least 15% Latter-day Saint based on the 2020 census. So they're asking a whole bunch of questions. The one that's relevant for this particular musing is here, that they are identifying the activity rate of Mormons within the so-called Western Corridor at 71%, and then outside of basically, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, it's 65%. So according to these individuals reporting in, using statistically significant models that do have a margin of error, although minor, 71% in the corridor and 65% without. So again, kind of hovering around or a little above 2/3. There have been others. 2016, Jana Reese did the Next Mormons survey and found 74% weekly attendance for Latter-day Saints. The Cooperative Election Study in 2002 found 69% attending weekly. Earlier this year, there was a Gallup poll found 67% of Latter-day Saints say that they attend weekly or nearly weekly. And according to the Gallup data, this has been fairly consistent over time. For example, from 2000 to 2003, the data showed 68%. There was a little uptick around 2011 to 2013. Interestingly, it went up to 75%, and now it's back down around 67%. Again, 2/3 or slightly above of Latter-day Saints attending weekly. Now, here's the rub. Here's the problem. All of these surveys, all of these polls rely on self-reported data. They're asking individuals to self-identify with a particular religion. They're asking them, how often do you go to church? And so people have a tendency to inflate the data to make themselves look good, even if it's to a random pollster they've never spoken with before, or they might outright lie. There was a study in 1990, or shortly after, somewhere in the 90s, and this study found that fully half of the Christians who called themselves weekly attendees were likely not. The study was called "What the Polls Don't Show: A Closer Look at U.S. Church Attendance." So they relied on, and this wasn't just Latter-day Saint churches. They relied on the attendance data from churches, and then the researchers even went out and counted cars in the parking lots. Here's what the study said. Characterizations of religious life in the United States typically reference poll data on church attendance. Consistently high levels of participation reported in these data suggest an exceptionally religious population, little affected by secularizing trends. This picture of vitality, however, contradicts other empirical evidence indicating declining strength among many religious institutions. Using a variety of data sources and data collection procedures, we estimate that church attendance rates for Protestants and Catholics are, in fact, approximately 1/2 the generally accepted levels. That's huge. Because all along, everyone's been patting themselves on the back. Look how religious and look how great, because there's this cultural narrative. Unlike in more secular societies where it's like, oh yeah, no, I don't go to church, I don't believe in God, blah, 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 right? They're like, there's no cultural stigma associated with that. But there is in the United States, given the kind of very deeply religious heritage of the country and many people's families, their upbringings. So there is a tendency to want to appear as if you are more religious than you actually, in fact, are. Now, counting cars in parking lots seems very arduous and still inadequate to really get at the issue. So Big Brother steps in, big data, big tech, and lo and behold, there are more refined and precise ways to track individuals' locations and thus be able to more precisely determine how often they're going to church. So there's an economist named Devin Pope. He was raised LDS. Apparently he no longer practices, or at least he hasn't said as much, but he did acknowledge he was raised LDS. He's a BYU graduate. And so he did a study very recently, came out using cell phone data, tracking 2.1 million Americans using their cell phones over nearly a year. The data set that he had access to went from April of 2019 through February of 2020. And this is all anonymized data. Of course, he had no way of knowing if it was Connors or Bob's or Mary's or Susie's or anything like that. It's de-identified. But a whole bunch of location data points to determine where these particular people were going. So he was able to take samples and do all the statistical jujitsu that one would need to in order to have representative sampling and use of the data. And so what he was using this data for was trying to get at this question: how often are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints actually attending? But then he wasn't just looking at Latter-day Saints, he was looking at all religion. A subset of his data and his reporting does focus on Latter-day Saints, and that's what we'll be covering here. So what does it mean to attend weekly? He had to, of course, determine what the criteria was in order to then report on what the data shows. And he used a very, I think, generous description or criteria, and that is individuals attending at least 36 weeks a year out of 52. So what he's doing here is he's accounting for illness, vacations, travel, so forth, and saying because oftentimes I'm not sitting in our chapel because I'm on a plane or, sick or whatever, right? So he's trying to say, let's be generous in our assumptions and say, whatever that is, 36 divided by 52, that's about 69%. So a little more than 2/3. If you're at least 2/3 weekly attending throughout the year, he counts you as weekly active for purposes of this report. So over about 5% of people attend religious services weekly across the United States. And so we'll get into the data in just a second for everybody, but focusing on Latter-day Saints, the big reveal, the really interesting thing from this data that he was able to compile and share, is that there are only about 1/3 as many Latter-day Saint weekly attendees as the number who claim to be Latter-day Saint weekly attendees in the surveys that I mentioned at the beginning. So you got this 2/3 of Latter-day Saints saying, hey, yeah, I'm active, right? And only about 1/3 of that number are in fact active. Here's what this guy Pope said. Almost surely we're seeing some social desirability bias, where people want to claim that they're weekly attendees and they're just not. But it feels good to answer yes to that survey question. Latter-day Saint individuals show that same bias in terms of overclaiming attendance. All right, so let's clarify this a little bit. In the U.S., which is where his data set was from, there are about 333 million people. And if you take that by 0.29%, that's what his data showed for Latter-day Saints, that 0.29% of the U.S. population were attending Latter-day Saint chapels on a weekly basis. Again, he's just got these little location pinpoints. And so he's able to then geographically target, okay, here's where all the LDS chapels are, kind of their GPS coordinates on a map. And so let's find all the location data points where people are going to one of these chapel locations, weekly, at least 36 times a year. The data ultimately showing that 0.29% of the U.S. population is hitting up LDS chapels weekly. So if you take 333 million, the U.S. population, times 0.0029, right, 0.29%, you get 965,000 weekly attendees for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Again, with this generous definition of what weekly constitutes. Now, the church reports having nearly 7 million members of the church in the United States, 6.868 million as of the end of last year. I've done a prior musing, of course, on that data and how it doesn't account for various things like people leaving the church and inactivity and even death and things like that. But that's what they say. Here's how many members there are, right? Total members, even if they're not attending, even if they haven't attended in 20 years. So then you say, okay, the highest from anything I've been able to find online and substantiated from different surveys and analyses from people smarter than me, the average sacrament meeting attendance, or we would say weekly attendance, is about a third. Like if you're at a bishopric or you have access to membership data, you can do this for yourself with a limited sample size of one ward, but look at how many people are in your total membership records, and then even just count how many people are showing up on an average Sunday. Do that for a month, average it out to get weekly attendance, and chances are you'll find around a third. So that means if we take the nearly 7 million members of the church that the church claims and cut it by 2/3 to get to that 1/3 active rate, we've got about 2.4 million active Latter-day Saints, which is fairly consistent with what those surveys are showing, about 2.9 million. So 2.5 to 3 million active Latter-day Saints, which is roughly 3 times what the cell phone data shows. Again, the cell phone data, the sampling from that is revealing that only about 965,000 individuals are attending LDS chapels weekly, whereas based on some of the other surveys and people identifying as such, it's about 3 times higher. Now, interestingly, Latter-day Saints, according to this guy's data, are overclaiming their weekly attendance less than other religions. In other words, other religions have a higher discrepancy between actually attending weekly versus what they're claiming. Ours is 3x, but some other religions are 4. For Protestants, it was a factor of 4. For some religions like Catholics and Jews, the discrepancy was much higher. So this again, social bias to want to claim that you're more active and involved than you actually are. But because of Latter-day Saints having such a high prevalence of weekly activity, the discrepancy is lower because there's just a lot more of us who actually are attending weekly. About 15% of U.S. Latter-day Saints appear to be weekly attendees, which is about triple the national average of 5%. So compared to other religions, we're doing much better, but 15% of U.S. Latter-day Saints is very insignificant compared to what is being claimed as members of the church. It's very low. A few random little data points. Of all the faith groups, Latter-day Saints, this was interesting, are the least likely to visit strip clubs, liquor stores, tobacco stores, but are actually somewhat typical when it comes to visiting casinos. So people of other faiths are going to the strip clubs and drinking, of course, and tobacco shops. That's no surprise because of the word of wisdom. But we're fairly typical when it comes to other religions as it pertains to going to casinos. I remember, I think I was 18. I went to a casino with a buddy of mine, and I put $20. I think I played a hand of blackjack or something, put $20 down, lost it immediately, and all of a sudden had no appetite to ever gamble again, and haven't. But apparently there's a lot of Latter-day Saints, or at least a similar proportionate amount from people of other religions who are going to casinos. Jewish synagogue attendees visit gyms more than any other faith group. So because he has all this location data, he was able to point out, okay, here's the strip clubs, here's the liquor stores, here's the sports arenas, here's the gyms. And so he was able to look at patterns of visiting some of these other places. Of course, this is very invasive and problematic because ultimately, even though the data set does not have personally identifiable information, in other words, your name, your phone number, and so forth, he didn't have access to that. What other studies have revealed with anonymized data sets like this is that you can very quickly deduce who some of these people are, right? So if you find a little, one of your data points that's going to an LDS church and then the Utah Capitol and then the Libertas Institute office, you can infer from that data that it's me, right? How many other Latter-day Saints are there who are going to the Libertas office and to the Capitol and to LDS chapels? Well, it could be someone on my team who's also LDS as well and has a role where they'd be up at the Capitol in addition to our office. But the point is you can hone in on that. And then if that data point goes to a particular residence every single night, you can look up in county records online who owns that parcel of land. Maybe they're renting and you can't figure out who the actual, resident is, but you can figure out the owner, and I own our property, my home, and so you can figure out who that is from anonymized, so this is all troubling from the amount of kind of Orwellian data points that exist for this type of thing. But it's also useful for studies like this. So there's kind of a dual-edged nature to having data like this. Now, totally unsurprising for Latter-day Saints, when you look at the weekly attendance, it plummets twice a year. Here's the chart. You can see in April and October when everyone's staying at home, glued to the tube for hours a day for general conference. So this is just validating the data, right? This clearly shows that he's onto something because that's exactly the pattern you would expect to see for Latter-day Saints. Now, for other religions, they have what I'll call inverse spikes. They don't have these huge plummeting dips. They have kind of a consistent baseline of weekly attendance, and then attendance skyrockets. As you might guess, if I were to ask you, when would attendance skyrocket for people of other faiths? I'm sure you guessed correctly. Here it is. Easter and Christmas. I remember growing up, our chapel was directly across the street from a Catholic chapel. And on Easter and Christmas, the cops would be out doing traffic control because there would be so many people overflowing their small parking lot, parking on the street and causing a local commotion because attendance skyrocketed far beyond what the capacity of the building and the parking lot was able to accommodate. So this isn't just, of course, Catholics, it's Protestants, it's many others. And this chart I'm showing shows all religious attendance across different faiths. So it's about 50% increase of attendance for Easter and Christmas. Now going back to the LDS data set, again, to kind of validate that this guy has some accurate information, here's a chart showing the hour of the day on Sunday for Latter-day Saints to be in the chapel based off, their phone location. And so what you see are three big spikes during the day. You got your 9 a.m. ward, you got your 10:30 ward, you got your noon ward, these rotations in the chapels of different people who are coming and going. We would expect to see that. Similarly, because we shifted to 2-hour church on January 2019, which was just a few months before this guy's data set started, what you see here in this chart is consistent with that as well. For 120 minutes, 2 hours is when you have this spike of the most number of Latter-day Saints. Now, you do see a drop-off after 1 hour, so we still got plenty of people who go to sacrament meeting and then take off. But the majority stick around for the 2 hours, and then it plummets. But it has kind of a long tail of people who are there for 3 hours, 4 hours. So these are your bishoprics, your Relief Society presidents, your whatever, your ward choir, people who are in the chapel for longer than just strictly the 2 hours of church observance. If you cut the data by state, of course, you're going to see Utah's an anomaly. Here, this shows all the states are kind of clustered together in terms of their religious adherence of residents in that state. And Utah stands out at a huge rate, nearly 80% of religious adherence at the state level and high weekly activity. So predictable. Now, there are some caveats to data like this, right? Cell phone data is not perfect. You can have unreliable cell phone towers. You could be in buildings that don't have good reception. People can turn off their cell phone and therefore not be pinging these cell phone towers. They can put their phone in airplane mode, which accomplishes the same purpose. They can leave their phone at home. Some people have dumb phones. Some people have no phones, especially kids, right? So this isn't really tracking most kids. And if way more Latter-day Saint, children had smartphones, then of course there'd be a lot more data reported here. So there are some limitations. Interestingly, though, here's a chart showing people when they're asked, how often do you bring your phone to a religious worship service across different religions? And what you see, the third one down, is for Latter-day Saints. Over 90% of Latter-day Saints say that they usually or always bring their phone with them. Now, interestingly, if you look at the right side of this chart, what you see, oddly, is that Latter-day Saints stand out compared to all the rest in not saying never or almost never. In other words, for other faiths, there's this subset, this minority of people who are like, oh, I never bring my phone. But Latter-day Saints, there's zero, right? It's about half the time as the smallest or the last segment there. People say, oh, about half the time I do, half the time I don't. But there's basically nobody saying that they only occasionally bring their phone or almost never or never. That's kind of interesting that we stand out in that respect. But writ large, we have a very high proportion of people who are bringing their phones and thus showing up in this data set. Now, overall, of course, church attendance has dropped in America. When Gallup did a survey 2 decades ago, 42% of adults in the United States said that they attended services regularly. Again, this is self-reported, so that number is surely inflated. But the data of self-reporting 2 decades ago was 42% of Americans saying that they regularly attended services. Now that figure has plummeted from 42% down to 30%. Again, still self-reported, but even with that same consistent data, you have this massive decline. The data, of course, from the cell phones, he's saying it's closer to 5% national average. Remember that for Latter-day Saints, it was 15% of Latter-day Saints attending weekly. He's saying the data shows that it's really around 5%. So that would be nearly a 6x inflation of people. Now, the question from Gallup is regular attendance. So again, you get this subjectivity of people being, oh yeah, I go for Easter and Christmas. I'm a regular attendee. So the data isn't good when self-reported. But the cell phone data of actual weekly attendance 36 weeks out of the year, at least based on this 1 year of data that he had, shows a very different result. It'd be very interesting, of course, to then now benchmark this and repeat this, now 5 years later from when that was done and see if there's any trends showing any changes. All right, let's wrap up. Why does any of this matter to us? Well, the obvious answer is that keeping the Sabbath day keeping the Sabbath day holy is a commandment. Exodus 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, that wasn't just a law of Moses, that's all wrapped up and done away with because Christ came. Christ himself, especially in modern times, during the New Testament, he was telling everyone, bread and wine and remember me. And he didn't necessarily say, have these worship services in a church building, right? The church was the ecclesia, the congregation. It was a community of people. So we don't really see in the New Testament any specifics around go to that building once a week and have this, particular regimen of services. But in the modern dispensation, in section 59 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord says, starting in verse 9, and that thou mayest more fully keep thyself unspotted from the world, thou shalt go to the house of prayer, and offer up thy sacraments upon my holy day. For verily, this is a day appointed unto you to rest from your labors, and to pay thy devotions unto the Most High. Nevertheless, thy vows shall be offered up in righteousness on all days and at all times. But remember that on this, the Lord's day, thou shalt offer thine oblations and thy sacraments unto the Most High, confessing thy sins unto thy brethren and before the Lord. So Latter-day Saints have a very special added emphasis on attending weekly. It isn't just this Old Testament, keep the Sabbath day holy, which many Christians might interpret as not necessarily meaning going to church services, especially, if there's no sacrament as part of it. It's just this, feel good, listen to a sermon type of circumstance. You might reasonably say, well, I'm keeping the Sabbath day holy in other ways. I don't feel in other faiths an obligation to attend weekly. That's not the case with Latter-day Saints. We're under special charge to do exactly that. And despite that, according to the cell phone data, and only in the United States of America, this isn't looking at other countries, 15% are adhering to that commandment. So yes, we can pat ourselves on the back. We're nearly triple other faiths or all religions writ large that are at about 5% of all Americans, rather. So we're better than everybody else in that particular data point. We're attending more often, or more of us are attending weekly. But clearly there's a huge discrepancy, right? Because that is a severe minority of Latter-day Saints who are actually attending weekly. There's a lot of tares mixed in with the wheat. There's a lot of inactivity. There's a lot of stale data on the membership rolls. Now, you can see from the church's perspective, they don't want to cut people off just because they're not showing up, because those people can always come back. But it would be more interesting if in addition to just saying, here's the total number of people on the membership rolls, if we had more concrete data around here's what is being reported by all the ward clerks at all the wards and branches who are counting all the numbers. Let's get the actual activity rate. The data exists. The church leaders review it. It's just not shared, perhaps because it's unflattering. But to me, that shows that we got a lot of work to do, even in our congregations where the activity rate can be fairly low. A lot of people grew up Mormon, or they've drifted away, or whatever, and or even people who say that they're active but just get kind of, slothful, lazy, indifferent about weekly attendance. So again, we have this as a commandment. We are told to go to the house of prayer weekly, to offer up our sacraments on the holy day, to rest from our labors. I did the musing a few weeks ago, a couple months ago, about keeping the Sabbath day holy and what that means. But in particular, we are supposed to be going to the house of prayer. Very important emphasis on gathering. So what do you think about the data? Scary, Orwellian, I know, but kind of an interesting way to really get past the BS of people self-reporting and being like, yeah, I attend weekly, right? Giving us a perhaps more clear snapshot of how many people are actually going to church. The data has limitations, as I said, for various reasons, people not bringing phones and so forth. But as we saw from the surveys, people are saying, I bring my phone nearly all the time. So though there are some deficiencies in the data, I think they're minor. And so even if the data is off by 10%, which I think would be generous, it's still showing drastically fewer numbers of members of the church attending than those who claim that they are. Now, there's other rabbit holes we could go down about why that is. People who have doctrinal issues, cultural issues, community dynamics, interpersonal conflict with people in their ward. It could be, for a lot of people, church is just boring, right? We talked months ago and I'm musing about that. There's a number of reasons, not just pure laziness, as I was kind of teasing in the title for this musing. But I think it would be important for us to really reflect on why people who identify as members of the church aren't going. I get that there are plenty of other people who are on the rolls, membership rolls still of the church, but they have severe doctrinal disagreements, or they see themselves as having left the church and I want nothing to do with the church. There's certainly those people. But there's a number of people who consider themselves Latter-day Saints, who tell pollsters, surveying them, yeah, I'm a Latter-day Saint, and yet they're not in the pews. And I think we ought to do a much more diligent job about figuring out why that is and what we can do to correct it, to pull those people back so that they can help us improve the community and be part of kind of edifying our Sabbath worship services. We'll wrap there. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you've seen this data before, a lot of this is new. This study just recently came out. This Pope guy put out a working paper, and Salt Lake Tribune and Deseret News and others covered it. But I thought it was worth looking into because it presents a new way to get at the question, and it reveals quite differently than what people are self-describing when asked by a pollster. So let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you next week.